Hi guys, good morning. In continuation of our CA Final Advanced Writing Professional Ethics Standards on Auditing revision. Now today we will discuss, we will get a revision of one of the standard, that is SA 510, that is initial audit engagements. So initial audit engagement opening balances. So this is a standard name. What is the meaning of initial audit engagement? Initial audit engagement, what is the definition of initial audit engagement? Definition of initial audit engagement is, initial audit engagement is the engagement for which the previous year financial statements has not been audited, or the previous year financial statements has been audited by the predecessor auditor. Then it is called as initial audit engagement. Second thing is opening balances. What is the definition of opening balances? Opening balances generally means the balances that are outstanding at the beginning of the financial year, or account balances that have been outstanding at the beginning of the financial year, or the closing balances or account balances of last year for which accounting policies has been applied, has been outstanding at the beginning of the next year, or nothing but opening balances. This is the definition of opening balances. Now, what is the scope of the standard? The scope of the standard is the auditor has the responsibility to verify the material misstatements exist in the opening balances to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence regarding material misstatements exist in the opening balances, and to draw conclusions on which the audit opinion is based. So this is the scope of the standard. And objective of the standard is, the objective itself is similar to the scope of the standard. What is the objective of the standard? The objective of the auditor is to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence regarding the material misstatements exist in the opening balances of the entity, and draw conclusions on which his audit opinion is based. This is the this is nothing but objective of the auditor. Now we will discuss about audit procedures that has to be followed in respect of opening balances. In respect of opening balances, the auditor has to follow the audit procedures as follows. First one is, he has to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence regarding the opening balances, material misstatements in the opening balances. That means whether the last year closing balances has been correctly brought forward to the current year, and accounting policies that have been applied in the last year has been correctly or appropriately applied, presented and disclosed in the opening balances of the current year. And if there are any changes that have been made to the opening balances of last year, has been correctly applied in the opening balances of current year. And the auditor has to obtain confirmation, the auditor has to see whether the opening balances, if at all any opening balances contain any misstatements, the auditor has to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence. Let's take a case that opening balances, if there are material misstatements exist in the opening balances. If the material misstatements exist in the opening balances, then auditor has to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence whether the effect of material misstatements in the opening balances that affects the amounts of current period financial effects on the current period financial statements, to what extent it affects the current period financial statements, and if there are any changes in the application of accounting policies, to what extent that changes in the application of accounting policies affect the current period financial statements. The auditor has to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence. And for obtaining sufficient and appropriate audit evidence, he has to apply audit procedures. Audit procedures are obviously we know two types of audit: risk assessment procedures and further audit procedures. In case of further audit procedures, there are two categories of audit procedures, that is test of controls and substantive procedures. Substantive procedures are again divided into two categories, that is test of details and substantive analytical procedures. So these are nothing but audit procedures that the auditor will follow to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence. And another thing is, if the predecessor audit report, if the previous year audit financial statements has been audited by the predecessor auditor, then auditor has to obtain perusing the audited financial statements of last year. If the predecessor auditor has issued modified opinion, then auditor has to see whether the financial statements of current year, the auditor has to verify whether material misstatements still exist in the opening balances that affects the current period financial statements, and he has to if the auditor concludes that the material misstatements still exist in the current period financial statements, he has to apply modified opinion as per SA 705. If the material misstatements does not exist in the current period financial statements, then he can give unqualified opinion or unqualified opinion in respect as per SA 705, and unqualified opinion, okay, unmodified opinion or unqualified opinion. Next, in respect of if the auditor is unable to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence, then auditor has to apply alternative audit procedures to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence. If the auditor is unable to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence through the audit procedures, and auditor is unable to perform alternative audit procedures, then auditor has to modify the opinion as per SA 705, either qualified opinion or disclaimer of opinion. If the auditor is there are two things. When the auditor will issue qualified opinion, adverse opinion. When the auditor issue qualified opinion, disclaimer of opinion. The auditor will issue qualified opinion or adverse opinion in case where the auditor is unable to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence through the alternative audit procedures. Also, the auditor will issue qualified opinion or disclaimer of opinion, because here auditor is unable to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence regarding the opening balances. If there is a material misstatement exists in the financial statements, in the opening balances of the financial statements, and it is and auditor is unable to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence regarding the material misstatement that exists in the opening balances of the financial statements, then in that situation the auditor will issue qualified opinion or adverse opinion, but not qualified opinion or disclaimer of opinion. Here auditor is able to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence regarding material. The auditor is able to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence regarding opening balances, but the opening balances contain material misstatements for which the auditor is unable to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence. Here, in case of previous case, the auditor straight away is not obtaining sufficient and appropriate audit evidence regarding opening balances. Their auditor will issue qualified opinion or disclaimer of opinion. Here auditor is able to obtain sufficient or appropriate audit evidence regarding opening balances, but there are some material misstatements which exist in the opening balances which the auditor is unable to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence. In that situation, auditor will issue qualified opinion or adverse opinion in the financial statements, in the auditor's report. Finally, and obviously we have discussed all the main points that are applicable in respect of SA 510 initial audit engagement opening balances. We have discussed what is the definition of initial audit engagement, what is the definition of opening balances, and what are the audit procedure, what are the scope of the standard SA 510, and what is the objective of the auditor, and we have discussed what is the objective of the auditor, and we have also discussed what are the audit procedures that the auditor will follow in respect of opening balances, and we have discussed opening balances, and we have discussed the responsibility of the auditor if there are material misstatements exist in the opening balances, and we have also discussed if the opening balances contain misstatements, then how the auditor has to deal with those misstatements, and we have also discussed if the predecessor auditor's report has been modified, predecessor audit report is modified, then what the auditor has to do in respect of current period financial statements. And we have also discussed if the auditor is unable to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidence, then in that situation what type of opinion auditor has to issue. We have discussed. This is entirely a concept of SA 510 initial audit engagement opening balances. Okay, that's all for now. Thank you.